The morning air smelled of salt and old smoke. It was 09:12 on April 5, 1942, when Anna Morozova felt the wind shift against her cheek and heard the first metallic crack, sharp, high, like a twig snapping, and knew the life of the man at the end of that sound was about to be measured in seconds. If this story matters to you, stay to the end, like and subscribe, and turn on notifications. These are the small things that keep forgotten histories alive. Anna had learned to count seconds for reasons that were not yet tidy or noble. She counted the seconds between breath and squeeze, between sight and sound. She counted for rhythm, for survival, and for the awkward arithmetic of grief. On that morning, the count began the moment a conscript farther down the street stumbled, shoved against a ruined facade, and then, panic, turned and ran. His feet made a staccato on broken stone. His shout was a small animal sound. In the space his movement made, something unseen shifted. Men who had been frozen under the weight of a single sniper's watch unfroze. A rear gun pivoted, and an entire line of fire reoriented toward a single new target. Anna's first decision that day was not to kill. It was to accept that killing would come, whether she wanted it or not, and to bend every possible rule toward saving the living. She was 22, thin beneath the patched greatcoat, hands calloused from rebar and winter, and eyes that habitually measured depth. She had been a student before the university turned into rubble, and the map of her youth into a list of names that no longer answered. Her schooling of a different sort had been brutal and quick. A winter in a makeshift training yard, hours behind the glass of a PU scope, then months of quiet study of enemy patterns. Where they drank, where they hid their messages, whether the German shoulder carried a habit of checking the same chimney at noon. What followed on that April morning was the kind of violence that is precise, antiseptic, and immediate. Anna saw where the panicked conscript had looked when he fled. She saw the dark smudge above the broken rotunda that most men in her platoon had learned to avoid. She adjusted for wind, left to right, roughly 3 meters per second. Checked her zero at 150 meters, and decided to use what the Army manuals, in their patient, bureaucratic voice, called a decoy. The word felt small for the thing she imagined. A scrap of cloth tied to a pole, a helmet perched where no head waited, a cigarette stub placed where a soldier might bend. She would not leave the decoy alone. She would make a nest for it, invite the hunter to take the bait, and arrange for a second rifleman to cover the expected arc of return fire. Reconciliance, Anna thought, was an argument with probability. She worked the argument until it favored life. The tactic was simple. Exploit the predictable anxiety of a frontline rifleman, or the more sophisticated confidence of an enemy sniper who believed his own invulnerability. The risk was entirely hers to accept. If the panicked soldier had not fled, the sniper might never have exposed himself. If Anna had been wrong about the shot line, a man could have been lost to miscalculation. But in the calculus of a siege, everyone was already a statistic. Soldiers were lost in barrages, in mines, in disease. What she tried to do was shift a few of those odds away from numbers and onto intention. Her rifle, a Mosin Nagant 9130 fitted with a PU scope, felt like part of her arm. She had learned its balance in the early hours of winter, how the wood creaked with humidity, and how to anticipate the tiny jump at the moment of firing. She could tell, by the whisper of the bolt and the candidness of the scope glass, whether a shot would land a beat early or late. That morning she lay with 2 other men behind the collapsed shell of a municipal library, the sun slicing low through ruined arches. The decoy, an overturned helmet on a broken broom handle, rocked when the breeze came through the street. Anna cupped the cheek of the rifle, exhale, fixed the crosshair on a narrow slit of shadow where a sentry had once stood, and waited. The shot came from a different place than she expected. It was a thin, laughing report, and then the sharp, clinical sound of wood struck. The first bullet took the helmet decoy precisely where she'd anticipated the enemy's aim. The second was a flinch in the air. Someone 3 blocks away had fired, seen the helmet move, and fired again reflexively. Panic begets error, and error is a small mercy in war. Across the street, the panicked conscript, barely 20, had stopped at the sudden, unexpected motion and was looking with eyes widened by fear and a sort of horrified fascination at the tiny human artifact that had been the target. It was the inflection of his gaze that mattered. He looked up, then down, then up again, and in that moment the sniper above the rotunda moved. He exposed himself by checking his line of sight, as if to confirm his own confidence. And into that brief, greedy motion, Anna pressed her finger. The kill was a fraction of a second, wrapped in a lifetime. Anna registered the faint bloom at the edge of his cheek in the scope, and then the recoil, the smell of spent powder, the way the world, for a moment, reduced to the mechanical certainty of 2 lungs inhaling and exhaling. She had not wanted this to be heroic. She wanted it to be accurate. The clearing party later described finding a man slumped against a broken column, a Mauser K98 at his knees, and a scarf knotted grotesquely at the throat. His face was not a story. It was a such. Geography of age and inked insignia and a single human failure to remain hidden. The press, always hungry for mythology, would call him the Terror from the Rotunda, in headlines that simplified fear into a name. Battle reports would tie that day's shot to a broader operational success, an artillery battery that could then be brought to bear, a supply line that reopened for a day. But historians would debate the precise chain of cause and effect for years. For Anna, the immediate fact was practical and merciless. One less enemy eye could mean dozens fewer dead on a bad day. Anna's methods did not originate from doctrine. They came from a long, private observation of how people behaved when watched and when afraid. In the months before that morning, she had sat with medics in cellars and listened to the stories of men who'd been hunted by snipers. They spoke in the same 3 complaints. Snipers chose chairs of high melancholy, bell towers, cupolas, factory chimneys. Snipers picked interdiction times with habit and comfort, and infantry doctrine punished caution with predictability. Command told men to keep moving, to change routes, to avoid known sightlines. The reality was that sleep-deprived recruits, hungry and frozen, defaulted to habits that a skilled predator could read. It is easier to stand on a known path than to invent a new one. She learned to weaponize that ease. Early in her service, Anna had been accused, formally, of insubordination. A lieutenant had scrawled the accusation in tired ink after she refused a patrol order that would have marched a dozen recruits through an open square at dusk. Her commanding officer listened to the reasoning. She described the pattern of the enemy and suggested a staggered route. But in the arithmetic of attrition, deviation was a defiance some leaders treated as symptomatic of a dangerous autonomy. She faced the tribunal's eyebrow, the bland pronouncement of an officer who had never trained a scope on a human being. The reprimand was marked, then quietly set aside. What was more consequential was the way the reprimand internalized in Anna the idea that institutional inertia would always lag behind tactical reality. If doctrine would not catch up fast enough to save lives, she would have to invent her own corrections in the field. There were costs. Those early innovations, decoys, dual nests, baited exposures, bought some lives and risked others. A few times she misjudged the wind or the second rifleman's line of fire, and a comrade fell. The descriptions of those losses in battalion logbooks are terse. KIA, no further detail. Anna kept more detail in her head. Short, clean, terrible inventories of what failed. The way a boot would sink into frozen slush. The fruitless angle of a body where a man had tried and failed to roll away. In her private moments, she would rehearse actions she had not yet taken, the ways to avoid repeating error, the adjustments that might tilt a probability by a degree. She also developed a ritual. After each engagement, she would wrap a scrap of ribbon, blue, faded from laundry, around the bolt of her rifle. It was not symbolic so much as functional. It was a reminder that the rifle belonged to a woman who had once been a student of numbers. Story and record diverge where press wants heroes. Wartime dispatches, printed hurriedly and with pleasing adjectives, listed Anna's confirmed kills in a tone of staccato pride. Unit records note several confirmed. Post-war historians, when they looked back, would argue about the difference between claimed, verified, and propagandized. The safest line is the one that acknowledges each. Reports listed a growing tally. Soviet wartime newspapers amplified it for morale. Later professors and archive holders compared lists and found gaps. Anna herself never kept a public ledger. She saw the list as a burden, not a resume. The siege hardened the city into a map of grief. Sevastopol's coastline was a serrated jaw that fed waves into broken piers. And the city's tall municipal buildings offered perches like teeth waiting for any careless passerby. Anna's unit rotated positions. A bakery roof, a collapsed opera house, the hollow or church bell tower. She learned the subtle differences. A roof that sloped offered no stable prone position. A bell tower's bricks allowed for concealment but broadcast the muzzle flash in a narrow window. She learned to note the smell of a place, gun oil, wet plaster, the faint yeast of bread that would have been baked before the war, and to read it for danger. Snipers were patterns, not ghosts. They moved in habits. Her reputation grew the way reputations do in wartime, incrementally, then suddenly. Men talked about the woman who could find a sight line where there was none and could predict the enemy's patience. Letters home, later translated for censors, painted her in bold simplicity, a hero. Photographers, one or two who managed to make the rounds amidst mortar fire, captured her in profile, the scope like a strange, elegant thing attached to a lean cheekbone. The images were later used for posters. She was useful as a symbol of feminine resolve and Russian tenacity. That publicity bought her a different kind of accountability. It pulled commanders toward decisions that favored appearances over nuance. Anna recognized the danger and resented the way her face became an argument in a language she did not trust. The question that moved the middle of her story, what line bends when a single panic shifts an entire battle, came a few weeks after the Rotunda shot. The unit received a new assignment, to take a contested street that ran like an artery through a ruined quarter, a short distance that commanded supply wagons. Intelligence reported, repeatedly and with the cadences of suspicion, the presence of an expert enemy sniper who had been harassing supply runs at dusk. The man, according to local rumor and wartime leaflets, was called the Watcher. Some accounts inflated him into a specter. Others, when later records were consulted, suggested he might have been a small cadre using multiple firing posts. Anna read them all and treated names like hypotheses. What changed the tactical landscape was not the roamer, but a young soldier named Mikhail Sokolov. He had arrived from the steppe 2 months earlier, round-faced and quick with speech, a brother to a man in a different battalion. He was not a sniper. He was a rifleman who had been trained to clear cellars and ferry supplies. On the day of the assault, 035, low light, frost that made breath white and animal, the men moved under a slate sky. They were to cross the narrow street in staggered bounds, guns low to avoid silhouetting, and Anna was to take a forward overwatch from the second story of a gutted printing house. Mikhail's panic was not theatrical. He had never been under sniper fire before. He'd read in pamphlets that snipers would take the long route and that running was sometimes as good as hiding. Somewhere between the first rush and the second, he tripped on a loose tile and fell, his rifle clattering. A sentry 3 houses down had a flash in his periphery and fired instinctively. The firing was not necessarily fatal to anyone in that fraction of time, but the arc of it did something else. It rewoke the watcher's instinct to act.
The enemy sniper, emboldened by the new visible motion and convinced a larger force had concentrated in the street, shifted posture. He moved to a more confident site, an exposed corner where his sight line could take the length of the street and watch the supply wagons. Mikhail did what panic compels. He moved again, this time into sight, trying to right himself and fetch his dropped rifle. His motion was ugly and human and utterly real. In the scope above the printing house, Anna watched him, noted the angle of the approaching bullets, and felt the old arithmetic loosen. To the soldier who panicked, she owed a decision. To the others in the street, she owed protection. To the state's expectation of heroism, she owed nothing. She coordinated quickly. There was a second rifleman, Petrov, who knew how to swing a Mauser in suppressive arcs. She had arranged the dual nest on a gamble that a more aggressive enemy would reveal himself when a prey moved unexpectedly. Petrov would cover the expected arc of return fire. Anna would take the most dangerous exposure. The plan was risky and uncouth in the eyes of doctrine. Expose one shooter to tempt a killer into a longer line of fire where the second could deliver the second shot. It was counterintuitive only if you believe that the fewer exposed, the better. In urban hunting, sometimes sacrificing a permitted exposure buys safety for many. She climbed the precarious stairs to a windowless alcove and set the rifle against a jagged bit of masonry. The print shop's interior smelled of old ink and damp paper. Outside, the street made a fragile lattice of men moving, of boots, then the
sudden clatter and the sound of Mikhail rushing again toward his rifle. The enemy's shot licked the air. Anna keyed her breath and watched, in the scope, the black aperture of the rotunda shift. The watcher crept, and then, in a calculation that was part arrogance and part habit, he stood to check the lane. That was the moment Anna had engineered. She fired. The shot arrived half a second after the enemy's movement. It connected with patient, terrible efficiency. The second rifleman, Petrov, covered the adjacent street and watched bodies crumple where they might have been men who had been counting on a different fate. When the clearing party went forward, they reported the watcher slumped where a lamp had once hung, a small note in his pocket with an address and a list of rations for the unit. The press would later turn this into a single villain defeated by a single woman, a miraculous assuming of order over chaos. Military historians would argue in footnoted journals that the watcher was not the single linchpin the newspapers had claimed, that supply lines had been tenuous for reasons beyond one sniper's removal. They would note that an artillery crew had been poised to exploit the opening. They would map timelines and notice that a battery's repositioning mattered as much as the kill itself. Still, on that street in the early morning, a panic had produced a chain. Mikhail's stumble, the enemy's exposure, Anna's shot, the battery's subsequent salvo. Whether those small events constituted the most shocking victory of the war is a phrase reserved for the rhetoric of memory and not the sober ledger of operations. What was true, indisputably, was that dozens of lives that day were spared a more brutal fate because the supply wagons moved, and the wagons moved in part because of that killing. The effect on doctrine was slower and bureaucratic. Her superior officers took notice and wrote terse dispatches recommending further study of bait and cover techniques. An instructor at the sniper school, curious and practical, visited the unit and watched Anna demonstrate the dual nest in the ruined courtyard. He scribbled notes, cross-checked measurements, range, wind, angle, and later included a terse example in a new training leaflet. The leaflet would not credit her by name in public circulation. It would anonymize the tactic to make it easier for command to adopt without the disturbance of personality. Yet behind the leaflet was an admission. Field improvisation could inform doctrine when the cost of waiting became obvious. This slow institutional adoption did not bring her solace. If anything, it brought attention. Reporters came once, in suits that didn't care for the smell of ink, and asked the same question: whether killing could ever be disentangled from necessity. Anna answered in the same way she handled her rifle, pragmatic, blunt, acknowledging the weight of what she had done. She said she hated killing. She said she did what she had to do to keep her comrades alive. She refused to turn her actions into moral absolutes. The cameras liked a softer phrase and printed her as both resolute and modest. The state liked a figure who could be held up as an example of citizen-soldier virtue. Anna, who had once been a student of comparative literature before pages turned into rubble, felt oddly literate in the vocabulary of duty and weary of being translated. The duel that would be called the climax, when two expert snipers met across a city that was already a palimpsest of blood, was not cinematic in the way novels imagine. It was arithmetic and boredom, a long wait for a second of decision. Anna had learned to enjoy and dread that boredom. It was the silence in which all the dangerous things had time to escalate. On the day the duel took place, the light was diffused through low clouds. The rotunda's cupola had been used as a sniper's perch and then abandoned. The opposing sniper had reappeared at dawn, possibly to check a line of sight, possibly to lull the defenders into a sense of resumed normalcy. Anna suspected he was good because his patterns were not obvious. He changed positions with deliberate slowness and used a camouflage of ragged cloth that made him impossible to see until he moved. She and Petrov set the nest as before, but with heightened patience. They waded through coughs, through the dull thump of an artillery piece 2 kilometers away, through the minor irritations of frostbite and hunger. The moment compressed into a span measured in breaths, heartbeats, and the ticking of a damaged wall clock. Then the other sniper moved, as if to check the flow of the street. Anna's shot needed to be a surgeon's, timed to the instant the enemy was most exposed, aimed at the neck where armor was thin, and timed so that the second rifleman could cover the probable return. The shot went through the aperture, the recoil sang in her shoulder, and the enemy collapsed like any man does when he no longer moves. There was no fanfare, there was only the meticulous work of the clearing party. What came afterward was the slow, complicated accrual of consequences. Her wound, scarred cheek from a ricochet months later that would remove her from combat, kept her from returning to the front lines. She toured hospitals and factories, speaking to assemblers and mothers and teenage boys who had never seen battle. The state decorated her. Unit records and military citations mention orders and commendations, whose phrasing shifted over time, from operational to propagandistic and back to archival. Post-war, museums would display her rifle in glass, the wood worn smooth where her cheek had lain. The photograph of her, taken by a young correspondent who favored stark contrasts, would be the one that haunted memory. The woman with a rifle, eyes meeting the camera, in a look that suggested both determination and an exhausted calculation that never stopped. She wrote once, in a letter tucked into a cardboard box her sister kept after the war, that she did not keep a tally in her head. "There are numbers in reports," she wrote, "but counts are not what keep me awake. It is the faces. They are not enemies on a page." The phrasing is not a confession so much as a clean, private inventory of consequence. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked only for understanding that in a machine as large and terrible as war, individual acts are less triumphalist than they are minute decisions stacked together. Historians later debated whether the dual nest baiting technique directly saved thousands, or whether it was one small innovation among many that shifted small probabilities in a theater of attrition. Archives show that training manuals adopted elements of the technique within months. Instructors recorded a shortened module on deception in baiting that taught students to coordinate two shooters, to estimate windage at 200 to 400 meters with an adjustment of no more than 3 clicks on a PU scope, and to always mark a recovery plan for the exposed shooter. The manuals anonymized the origin of the module but acknowledged its practical value. Where public memory wanted a singular narrative, one woman, one shot, the arc of a war reconsidered, scholars built a mosaic of small changes that gradually changed outcomes. Both readings are true in their own registers.
Anna's life after the war was not a parade of parables. She married a man who had been a sapper, moved to a small city, and taught marksmanship to police units and sports clubs. The rifle that once fit like a prosthetic became, in a glass case, an artifact that young cadets would stand before and whisper about, as if artifacts could transmit feeling. She never stopped coming to the museum on the anniversaries, tracing the grain of the wood with a finger that had been steady enough in combat and small enough in curiosity. When she died years later, a photograph of her in uniform, eyes leveled with the camera, was pinned in a folder at the local historical society. Her sister kept the box with the ribbon-wrapped bolt. There is a photograph that most histories reproduce. Anna sitting by a broken window, light on the left side of her face, the rifle across her knees. Her eyes look outward, not at the camera, as if she is measuring a distance no longer present in the world. It is the image that resists simple interpretation. It is not triumph or apology. It is a record of a woman who learned to make decisions under pressure and to measure their cost afterward. Memory compresses events into neat verdicts. History insists on footnotes. The press called that moment a shocking victory. The claim is understandable. The narrative is tidy and dramatic. Yet the fuller truth is less sensational and more instructive. A soldier's panic changed the geometry of attention for a few seconds. Anna used those seconds to rearrange risk. A battery moved and an artery of supply
flowed that otherwise might have bloodied another morning. Technicians in training manuals later wrote about bait and cover in sober lines of type. The victory, if it is to be called that, was not a single miraculous reversal, but a small, decisive correction in an enormous, grinding system of violence. It was shocking not because it was miraculous, but because it revealed how tiny human motions, fear, instinct, calculation, can pivot the fate of many. In the end, the legacy was both tactical and moral. Military schools taught the technique. A side effect of adoption was fewer accidental losses on certain routes. The human cost, though, remained unquantified. The faces that Anna could not forget, the panicked soldier whose fall started a chain, the enemy whose life she had taken and whose existence later became fodder for propaganda. That is the ambivalence that clung to her life, a professional competence that saved bodies, and a private, persistent tally of faces that did not answer. She never reconciled the tally because there was nothing to reconcile it to. Reconciliation suggests an agreement between two parties. War left no such counterpart. Instead, she adjusted, an engineer of practical ethics, until each decision matched as closely as possible the ends she valued, to see as many comrades home as the day allowed. That was a standard neither lauded nor argued in newspapers. It was a working principle, humble and hard, lived in the margins of operational orders. Years later, a young sergeant would stand before her, rifle, in the museum and say, quietly, that he had heard the story of the day a panicked man ran and the city lived. It was a story that traveled in different registers, a caution, a lesson, a fragment of national myth. For those who studied tactics, it was a case study of improvisation under pressure. For those who remembered faces, it was a ledger and a wound. Anna's photograph remained, as photographs do, both revealing and spare. In it, her eyes did not promise closure. They offered only the witness of someone who had watched a human moment, panic, move a city, then carried the aftermath like a stone in a pocket. To learn the story is to recognize the uneasy alliance between skill and sorrow, between the small ingenuity that sometimes saves and the moral residue that never quite lets go. If you found this account meaningful, please subscribe, like, and comment below where you're watching from. Sharing these stories helps keep them alive, and your voice matters in remembering the complicated past. The rifle sat under glass like a thing that had been taught to sleep. Daylight pooled on the polished stock, and every so often a schoolchild's breath fogged the pane and then cleared, unaware that fogging and clearing had once been verbs for a life. The plaque beside it bore the tidy sentence the city preferred: Anna K., 1987, for courage under fire. A smaller line below credited the tactical improvisation that had spared a supply corridor. Visitors read the lines in a rush, like vows learned on a tour, and moved on to uniforms and medals and model trucks. But in the back room of the Historical Society, behind files of wartime menus and the yellowed programs for a mayoral memorial, there was a manila folder with a photograph folded into its paper like a pressed leaf. Anna's sister, Marta, had insisted that it remained closed to casual browsing. "It's not for display," she told the curator once, with her knuckles white around the box containing the bolt. "It's for keeping." Marta's hands had learned to keep things without making them heavy for the rest of the world. She had not learned to keep them without living with weight. Months after Anna's death, when the museum arranged a small memorial display, the curator, an earnest, thin man named Eli, wore two hats: institutional steward and curious custodian. The institution wanted the story to be instructive, to teach tactics, and to celebrate service. Eli wanted the story to be true. Those two wants were not enemies. They were awkward cousins who spoke in different rooms. One late autumn morning, Eli unlocked the back room to fetch a ledger and found Marta there already, the bolt box in her lap. She had come to look, she said, and to bring something she had finally decided to yield: a packet of letters tied together with a strip of fabric the color of dried blood. "She wrote sometimes," Marta said, "when she could sleep. I told her not to send them. She sent them anyway." Her voice was flat with the fatigue of a long restraint. Eli sat opposite her at the crate-turned table and opened the letters with a care that felt like a small ceremony. The ink had faded to sepia, the paper smelled of cellar air and lemon oil. There were marginal notes, maps scrawled on envelopes, and once, pressed between two pages, a child's drawing of a sun that had been sketched on the back of an identification slip. The letters were not triumphal dispatches. They were, instead, pages of arithmetic and confession, lists of names she had seen, names she could not forget, a draft of a report that never made it into the official files, an attempted inventory of those moments when fear, like an animal, redirected a flow of bodies. She kept track, Marta said. She thought counting would help. Sometimes it did, mostly it didn't. Eli read for hours, until the desk lamp made a small island of gold on the table and the rest of the room fell away into the shadowed stacks. Anna wrote, in a handwriting both economical and exact, about a man whose foot had slipped on a wet stair and whose prayer she could hear as if it were a word repeated like a mechanical key. She wrote about the rumor that the other side had built a pamphlet out of one soldier's death and that the pamphlet had embroidered the episode into martyrdom.
In a later letter, she admitted that she had sent a short note once, anonymously, to a name she had found in a field report, a name that had been listed as Enemy Combatant 43. She had written nothing but the old barter of grief, an acknowledgment, unsigned. "For what good that does," she scribbled in the margin. There were also photographs, some official, some taken by hands that trembled with the haste of witnesses. One showed Anna with her hair cropped close, the muzzle pointing not toward the camera but to the floor, as if the weapon were more a tool than an emblem. Another, less flattering, showed a blurred figure running and the blurred aftermath of a formation that had not completed because one man had gone the wrong direction. The letters folded around the pictures like a protective shell. Eli found, folded into the last envelope, a page marked in a different ink, a single paragraph written to a name that did not belong to any official roster. It was short and plain and startling in its tenderness. "If you read this," Anna wrote, "then perhaps you are a child or the family of a man who does not live anymore. I will not pretend that these words unmake what happened. I only offer them as my witness and as my regret. I kept a ledger, and there are entries I cannot reconcile. I do not ask for forgiveness I have not earned. I ask that you know this. I kept the faces as if they might be returned." She signed nothing. The existence of the note changed the frame. Public history liked narratives with clear edges. Private history liked margins. The curator felt both responsibilities prick at him, to the museum's patrons and to the people whose names had been scrapped into the letters. How to make a show that honored service without amputating sorrow? How to teach tactics without teaching erasure? Word of the letters leaked, inevitably, and in a way that made all involved feel both exposed and oddly comforted. A reporter came and asked if Anna had been a hero. Another asked if the letters proved anything. A third wanted to know whether the museum would make the letters available online. The Historical Society's board discussed contextualization in measured tones. They proposed a timeline, a small placard that would allow for nuance without inviting controversy. The city council, eager to keep the public peace, suggested a moderated panel to discuss ethics in conflict. Everyone spoke as if the story were a marble to be set on a plinth. No one wanted the plinth to tilt. Marta insisted that the letters remain physical, that the paper be seen and touched only by those who sought it with patience. "There is a weight to holding this," she said. "You lose something when you make everything a screen." Her argument had the force of a reluctance that had matured into principle. Eli agreed in theory and outlawed the scanner. A reporter came and asked if Anna had been a hero. Another asked if the letters proved anything. A third wanted to know whether the museum would make the letters available online. The Historical Society's board discussed contextualization in measured tones. They proposed a timeline, a small placard that would allow for nuance without inviting controversy. The city council, eager to keep the public peace, suggested a moderated panel to discuss ethics in conflict. Everyone spoke as if the story were a marble to be set on a plinth. No one wanted the plinth to tilt. Marta insisted that the letters remain physical, that the paper be seen and touched only by those who sought it with patience. "There is a weight to holding this," she said. "You lose something when you make everything a screen." Her argument had the force of a reluctance that had matured into principle. Eli agreed in theory and outlawed the scanner.
A small exhibit was designed. Less gloss, more hushed textures. The rifle remained under glass, but beside it the plaque would now include Anna's Wedger entry number, the solitary anonymous paragraph, and a line that read, "Memory is not one thing." There would be an audio track, low archival voices reciting snippets of letters, that invited listening rather than cheering. The show would ask visitors to stand with a measure of unease. On the opening night, the room smelled of coffee and the metallic tang of the climate control. People came wearing the city's usual constellations, veterans who had been young then and whose uniforms now bore the soft patina of long service, families with children who pointed at the gun and whispered, students with notebooks. Marta stood near the case, her fingers within reach of the bolt box, as if proximity could turn history tender. Eli watched her from across the room and felt the slow vertical hum of a decision settling into place. A man in his 60s approached the display and lingered with the kind of concentration that belonged to people who had learned to look for seams. He read, he listened to the audio, and then he moved away from the crowd toward the back, toward the archive door. He found Eli and said, simply, "My brother carried that day with him." He said it as a fact, an addition to the ledger. He told the story as a warning, he added, voice thin with memory. But he also said that he had never known if errors saved or harmed more. Eli invited him to sit. The man, Harold was his name, produced a small photograph from his wallet, a young soldier in a uniform that matched no parade, but matched a life, a face that had angles softened by the years of a grainy image. "He panicked," Harold said. "He ran. He told me so plainly once, as if that explained everything. He also said he was grateful to someone for stopping the run. He never named her. He just said, someone rearranged the danger." The juxtaposition of Harold's private memory and the museum's display became the fulcrum of a different conversation, one that occupied the small rooms of people who had been there and never wanted the city to forget the complexity. They argued that the exhibit needed to read not as a clean lesson in improvisation, but as a meditation on consequence. Others said that the public needed a simpler tale to rally behind, especially with anniversaries approaching and political speeches planned. In the weeks that followed, the exhibit drew more attention than the society had anticipated. Students wanted to interview Marta. Veterans wanted to add their own marginal notes to the guest book. A local theater troupe asked to film a rehearsal in the low light of the hall, but Marta refused them entry. A university professor suggested a symposium about small actions in large systems. A mother came with her adolescent son and left without looking at the rifle at all, having been struck instead by the audio's quietness and the presence of names without easy closure. Eli found himself fielding requests for permissions and making choices that felt less like curatorial judgments and more like moral triage. Each choice, what to label, which photographs to display, whether to transcribe the anonymous paragraph, was a small valve that altered how the city remembered itself. He discovered, with a private astonishment, how fragile the hinge was between honoring and obscuring. Marta, for her part, began to write her own marginalia. She added a notebook to the back room, simple pages bound with string. Visitors who came with patients could read Marta's short notes, observations about how people read, fragments of Anna's habits, the way the sister sometimes hummed when no one was listening. She hummed differently after some nights, Marta wrote once. It was as if she practiced making peace with the wrong notes. The ledger, Anna's ledger, continued to exert a gravity. There were entries that made more sense with distance, routes that had been altered, times when a radio call had been misheard and turned a formation into a scatter. There were entries that refused tidy explanation, a remark about a child's shoe found in a field that suggested a life stopped but could not be placed on a map. The letters refused to be mere evidence. They acted like companions to memory, insisting that the city carry an unclosure. And so the city did, in small ways. A school teacher used the exhibit to teach students about ethics under pressure. A local columnist wrote a piece titled "The Cost of Saving" that balked at simplistic praise. A young sergeant, different from the one who had once stood before the case and whispered, came with his platoon and did not speak. He lingered, then saluted the photograph with the careful, private ritual of soldiers who would rather talk to an image than to a crowd. The story of Anna, once a photograph and a press line, began to expand into a net of small practices. An oral history group that met monthly, a scholarship in her name for veterans returning to school, a practice at the museum of inviting a different family each year to speak a name into the hall. The city did not solve the ledger. It learned, tentatively, to live with it. Months later, Eli received a letter from abroad. It was thin and had the slant of a hand unpracticed in formalities. The writer called herself Lila and said she had found a pamphlet in a village that named a man whose face matched one of the blurred photos in Anna's packet. She did not demand anything. She wrote of the ways people kept grief. By planting a sapling, by caking a cup to the sea, by writing a poem in a notebook. She asked a single question. "Would you tell me what you have of Anna?" Eli printed the letter and placed it on Marta's desk. The paper seemed to carry through its fibers the expanding fold of the story, the way other lives could reach backward and touch an event, how a single arm of consequence crossed borders and languages. Marta read and then nodded, a slow, decisive nod that admitted the small pleasure of being corresponded with across distance. "What should we send?" Eli asked. Marta tapped the bolt box with a fingertip and then reached for the manila folder. She folded and unfolded the letter as if weighing both its paper and its prudence. "We will send a photograph," she said. "We will send an excerpt and a map. We will not send everything." Her refusal was not secrecy. It was a protection that recognized the human cost of making private grief into public material. They prepared a small packet to mail, and then, because the world is rarely tidy, they received a call from a national broadcaster who wanted to run a feature. The piece would frame Anna as the woman who saved the city, with a line about hard choices in war. The curator said yes with the caution of someone who knew the currency of images. Marta, after a measured silence, consented with conditions. The letters would be referenced but not read aloud in full. The anonymous paragraph would be quoted only in translation and not dramatized. On the morning the segment aired, the city's old radio tower sent the signal into homes and cars and bus windows. People who had not been inside the museum listened and felt a shift as the story of Anna moved back into the public air. There were letters to editors and comments in cafes. There were 2 op-eds that crossed swords politely about the merits of historical ambiguity. In a small park near the river, 2 veterans argued, loudly but without malice, about whether the addition to the plaque had softened or strengthened the city's memory. For Eli, the broadcast felt like a loose hinge closing and opening at once. The exhibition had changed the story's surface without erasing its depth. Yet he knew, or thought he knew, that there remained another reckoning to come, an event that would force the ledger into daylight in a way the museum could not entirely frame. He felt it as one feels a change in the weather, the pressure building, a hush before wind. On an ordinary afternoon, less ceremonious than the broadcast, a woman arrived at the society's door carrying an envelope the thickness of a few pages and the look of someone accustomed to traveling with truths. She asked to see Marta. When Marta stepped into the reading room and saw the woman's face, strong, lined, and resolutely calm, she felt the ledger in her pocket pull taut as if someone had taken hold of its edge. The woman placed the envelope on the table. Inside were documents from a different archive, military papers, small receipts, and a photograph of a man wearing a uniform with a badge that had been obscured by time. Tucked beneath
The photograph was a small scrap with a child's handwriting that spelled a name the city had never seen printed in its papers. The woman's voice, when she spoke, carried a language of places ankle-deep in mud and of names that had been planted like seeds in foreign soil. "My brother," she said, "was on that road. He died there. We found this now because someone kept records in a warehouse." She did not blame. She asked, simply, for the story to be told with the man's name inside of it. Marta looked at Eli, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The museum's display had already tried to make room. Now the space demanded a new honesty, that the ledger might be shared, not to settle debts, impossible, but to permit mutual recognition where possible. They opened the packet together. The photograph that slid into view showed, in crisp detail, a face that matched the blurred edges of Anna's notes. The child's handwriting folded like a small tide. Khalid. Ink faded but legible. For a single, compact hour, the city sat between 2 practices, remembering in a way that honored its own, and remembering in a way that recognized the names that had been written in other hands. A plan formed, not out of spectacle, but out of a cautious courtesy. Marta and Eli agreed to invite the woman, Lila they called herself now, though the envelope had not said so, to speak at a moderated evening. They would invite others, Harold, the man whose brother had panicked, veterans, students, the woman from abroad. The objective was not to adjudicate, but to convene, to make the museum a place where fragments could be put into conversation. The evening they chose was cold and clear. The museum lights made the rifle shadow long and black on the floor. People arrived carrying their own ledger weights, photos in pockets, letters folded like talismans, a prayer in their mouths. The room filled with breaths and the coughs of old soldiers and the soft shuffle of programs. They sat in chairs arranged like a town circle, an ancient form of deliberation suited to a modern need. Eli introduced the format, brief remarks, then listening. He read a passage from Anna's letters, the anonymous paragraph, without comment. Lila spoke and, in a voice that threaded both grief and generosity, said the name aloud. Khalid. Harold spoke and admitted his brother's panic and also his brother's gratitude to the someone who had stopped the run. Marta handed out copies of the photograph and the child's scrap. When the microphone finally passed into the audience, hands rose not for sound bites but for small reckonings. A young man asked whether remembering could change anything at all. A woman asked if naming the dead made less room for the living to forgive. A veteran asked whether a ledger was not merely a list of failures. Answers were not tidy. Sometimes there was silence long enough to be its own response. At the end,
Own contradictions with a steadier hand.